in ending poverty. So the kind of collaborative efforts that I think are in progress still need to be better tapped, both in ways that we can harmonize what's going on, as well as take it to scale for the kind of impact that is truly possible.
I also think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about kind of the ongoing challenges around violence against women here in the United States and around the world. Clearly, ameliorating this challenge has both legal dimensions to it as well as cultural dimensions to it, and I think those two dynamics are frequently discussed. But I also think really this is another area, kind of extending what Jane said, where really many of you have a platform. I mean, certainly in the United States, we have a good body of research that demonstrates that kind of the changes in laws and then the changes in kind of private companies' practices really were in the vanguard that later changed kind of family home environments, where women were legally protected, both kind of in the sanctity of their homes in theory, but were legally and then actually protected in their workplaces. That strongly correlated to then women ultimately being able to better stand up for themselves at home and also to their husbands and other male relatives, kind of better understanding and ultimately then respecting kind of their rights to sanctity of space and person. So again, I think there are opportunities for all of you to use your platforms, as Jane aptly said, to help advance whatever kind of you think is most a challenge for you and your companies wherever you work in the world. And I certainly hope that you'll look at what has worked and what still needs to be done to try to help close that gap.
Right. Jane, could I just add to
absolutely,
that,
Melanne, yeah.
because I think Chelsea raised a really good point. Violence against women is a global scourge. And we also know that women's economic empowerment and independence dramatically makes them less insecure and less likely to be violated. Not the perfect solution, but has a tremendous impact. I would also urge companies in many countries, the private sector has enormous clout. And to use its advocacy clout with governments in ways that appeal to the government's self-interest. This issue of violence against women is both a horrible human rights issue. It is a health issue with tremendous consequences, perhaps also with the incidence of HIV, and there are programs that work with adolescent girls that the private sector has been involved in, Together for Girls, for example, to help lessen that possibility of violence affecting the adolescent girls. But it's also a productivity issue. We learned that in the United States. It was the private sector in the United States that, in the end, helped get the Violence Against Women law passed because it made points to members of Congress who weren't persuaded in other ways that this has a tremendous negative impact on the economy. Women not able to show up for work, being mindful, their minds elsewhere in terms of their children and what's happening to their family, had consequences. So the role of all of us working through some of these issues, but not underestimating the power of the private sector, even in this space, as has been demonstrated time and time again. I see Andrea Jung here, and when she was heading up Avon, we worked a really tremendous collaboration between the State Department, Avon, and the NGO Vital Voices to focus on this issue of violence, because clearly what's happening with companies today is their brand and, let's say, this kind of activity that was once described as CSR, and I think we're moving more in a different direction where it's enmeshed in the brand, is in terms of Avon associated with violence against women, fighting the scourge. And what they were able to do is join with us in tapping the Secretary's Fund at the State Department with an infusion of resources to go to those programs that our embassies and others knew were extraordinarily excellent programs that needed to be scaled up, and then working with this NGO to ensure that the best practices became known more broadly, and they were able to grow all of that. So you had both spotting some of the best efforts that were being made in targeted countries around the globe. You had resources going to those NGOs, and you had them coming together with others to be able to spread the word on best practices and then to grow the possibilities. So there's a lot of work in this space that can be done, and it's very exciting with incredible payoffs no matter how difficult this challenge is.
Great. I think I'm building on that, and not just as it relates to some of the really difficult questions of violence against women, human trafficking, human rights abuses, but just sort of raising awareness about all the issues that we're looking at today, the rights, the empowerment, and the opportunities. I'd like to come back to this question that both of you have raised, and the No Ceilings project is looking at, Chelsea, of data. And not just data, but I'm very struck by both of you picking up this sort of this balance between statistics and stories. And both of those, I think, are so important. And how do we do a better job, and how can the business community do a better job both on the data and research side? So we talked about how we can use business platforms, business brands, business value chains, business as sort of public policy advocates, but how can we use the research capability and data gathering capability of business and the storytelling capability of business so that we've got the Bessie Magali stories as well as what the statistics are behind her personal story. And I'd love to hear from both of you on that thought and also how we use technology.
I think that in many ways that question is probably best answered by the people in this room in some ways, kind of for how businesses can help fill the various data gaps that we still confront in even understanding the contours of these different conversations that we've already had this morning. I think UNICEF recently came out with their report on the kind of the state of the world's children in 2014, and I think that it really evidenced kind of what the implication of data gaps really are. If only a third of births approximately are recorded in the DRC every year, clearly that has tremendous implications then for how we can track kind of a child's development or understand kind of what the gender gaps are between the different experiences of boys and girls around the DRC. And although kind of that was the most extreme example, almost every country, including even the United States, had kind of different data gaps that persist. And so the ways in which the private sector can help fill that is, I would hope, a question that each of you would think about and come up with answers for, kind of in the spirit of creative cooperation and kind of a collective network committed to understanding this challenge and then designing solutions to address it. I also think it's important that we kind of better marry the relationship between statistics, data, and stories. And I think that really is a way in which technology can come into play here. So that it's not just the statistical tables, which I think are hugely important, and it's not just the vignettes, which I also think are hugely important, but it's also ensuring that the data is compelling and inescapable. So really using data visualization to help do that, particularly given that we know the millennial generation, whether we're talking about kind of here in New York City or yesterday I was talking to a man who owns a technology startup in Nairobi, kind of whether it's here or in Nairobi or anywhere in between or beyond, increasingly young people are visual. learners and visually engage in the world around them. And so kind of figuring out how to distill the data so that it's not overwhelming, but so that it is inspiring to young people, to kind of help them figure out kind of what part of this challenge they want to tackle, what they want to advocate their governments to do, what they want to ask their employers to do, what they want to encourage their friends to care about and to show up and vote on or protest about, I think is really important. And I think we have a real opportunity as we kind of galvanize attention between now and the 2015 20th anniversary of Beijing to figure this out and to figure out kind of what data visualization is most resonant kind of with different young audiences around the world. 70% of sub-Saharan Africa is under 30. So if this is something that we want to kind of make progress on, we have to reach out and enfranchise people who are even younger than I am. And I think we enfranchise them by not only informing them, but informing them in ways that will be meaningful to them and useful to them and empowering to them. So I would welcome any suggestions that you all have as to how best we can, again, kind of diagnose these gaps, kind of better help fill these gaps, and then better help kind of evangelize about what the gaps are, what the opportunities are, and to empower young people around the world to help solve these challenges.
Melanne, yep.
I think that was an excellent question, Jane, because I do believe the marriage of data and the narrative is critically important, and particularly for different audiences. And I want to thank the business community, because I think you were ahead of government in some ways, because you're always focused on the bottom line, and you've got to prove why you're making these investments and what pays off and what doesn't pay off, and basically put us, or when I was in government, to the same test of essentially show us why this is a program that can make a difference. Why are we investing in this space? So data is important, and I think the business community gets that, and in fact has led the way on that. I have also found in my work that I can make a case, as I think is the most fundamental case to make, about investing in women in terms of what women deserve by virtue of the dignity of each woman. That will make most leaders' eyes glaze over, I assure you. I've been there, when I'm about to be passed off to the young staffer with that kind of argument. But if I can talk about why it is in the self-interest of that leader or that company or whoever's engaged in this in terms of the data, it's completely turned around. But I do believe that that alone is not sufficient, certainly for all audiences. And the ability to show, as Chelsea showed in the 5x20 example, as many of you have shown in the work that you do, why you're doing it, because it truly does change lives. And the stories of how those lives are changed are truly what we remember. We may not remember the numbers, but we will remember the story of that woman or her children or her family, or the story of the life changed. So we need both. And I think, the Nike Girl Effect ad had such an impact on the whole space around girls because it made the case of what happens through this cartoon effect of what happens when you invest in a girl and what happens if you don't invest in her. And then out of that come the stories of the lives changed, which they've done in building the narrative. So I do think both are important, but I am extremely grateful for the focus on the data that has largely been led, I believe, by the private sector.
I also think one of the reasons that the Nike Girl Effect was so resonant is because the Nike Girl Effect program went to 15 different countries and talked to girls in 15 different countries. And then road tested different ads with those same girl audiences in different countries. And so girls were enfranchised from the beginning in kind of helping articulate what they saw as their real challenges, and then in kind of helping to own what the narrative was around those challenges, and also the statistics that were part of that narrative and that were so kind of beautifully deployed to help tell all of girls' stories. And I think that that's another there's another important lesson in that kind of for efforts kind of targeting young people, they have to be legitimate, and they're only legitimate by kind of enfranchising young people from the beginning, which is why I was so thrilled that Jane recognized all of the young leaders who are here, kind of college age, in their 20s and their 30s, because it is crucial that kind of we are included in these conversations from the beginning, so that we do then feel ownership and also accountable for then the work ahead.
No, I agree. And I think, to me, one of the most untapped corporate opportunities out there at the moment, we hear a lot about the role of boards of directors, and more companies are setting up sort of sustainability, corporate responsibility advisory committees. But I'm amazed at how few companies have set up sort of, youth advisory committees or networks to really tap in, even many companies who are youth facing, but I think all companies could really benefit from a more structured approach, to listening to and hearing from young people.
Which, really, I applaud the UN here, because for the high-level panel around the sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals effort, the high-level panel reached out deliberately to young people. And had a young person's advisory board. So certainly we've talked about the ways in which the private sector has been a leader. This is an area in which the UN very much has been a leader. And so I think it's important to acknowledge and applaud that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the challenge for some of the companies out there. I have dozens more questions I'd like to ask, but we, as always, are running out of time. So what I'd like to do is open it up. I'm told that there's a button there which is apparently obvious on your desk. What I'd like to do is probably take sort of 3 questions at a time, and hopefully we can get at least sort of 2 rounds of questions, short, snappy, succinct questions or comments. And if you can identify yourself as you make it. So I see a gentleman over there and a lady there and someone at the back there. So,
reach scale. We've been working on these issues for a number of years. And I'm curious about whether or not anyone could point us to the tests that have been run, trying a variety of models in a variety of countries and locations. And you could just take maternal health as an example. Sometimes we end up with big organizations looking at other big organizations for solutions. And the conversations happen when the solutions are actually being tested by social enterprises and other organizations on the ground, which actually don't get paid attention to and don't get brought into an environment where their work is actually shared and can benefit the rest of the world. So I'm curious about whether or not you see that happening, how you see it happening, and how should it get going if it's not happening.
Great. So recognizing that the work and the impacts of on-the-ground organizations. One here.
In a few weeks is CGIU, which she's the first is participating in again. So I wanted to ask you about what you think the business community can do to support all of the projects and commitments at CGIU.
Great, thank you.
Great question. And there's one right at the back there.
Can you hear me? Okay, I hear myself. So my question pertains to, we talked a lot about data. Has there been any initiatives to look at the women that are actually working in data and have analytical backgrounds? Because there are so few, and those who are there almost automatically will look at women and women's issues within their corporations.
Great, thank you. Well, let's go with those 3 first, and then we'll hopefully, as I say, have another couple of rounds.
Sure. So briefly, on the first question, I completely agree. I think that so often really the charge for, whether we call them nonprofits, NGOs, kind of social entrepreneurs, is to fill the gap between what kind of governments currently are providing and what the private sector is currently producing. So I couldn't agree more with your formulation. There really isn't sort of what I would call a solutions hub for kind of what has worked holistically in different areas, and I certainly think that there should be, and so we should build one. I guess is what I would say. On the second point, on CGIU, CGIU is the Clinton Global Initiative University program in which we bring together, yes, young leaders and not just, indeed, future leaders. Every year we have about 1,000 students who come from every state, dozens of countries so far. Since 2008, we've had more than 5,500 students come from more than 130 countries. Collectively, they've made kind of 4,000 of their own commitments to action, kind of what their action plans are to help attack a problem that they see either on their campus or in their home country or maybe even on another continent. And one of the things that we've been highly focused on over the last few years is ensuring that the students who really do have great ideas, not only kind of incubated but already in action, can be mentored and receive seed funding so that those ideas can really become their jobs for when they graduate and that they can help scale their organizations. And so we've done that in a couple different ways, by coupling students with mentors either from sort of the social sector, if that's the right answer, or from the private sector, and also connecting them to real funding opportunities. Sometimes it's really just a few $1,000s, sometimes it's $10,000 or $20,000, and we've really seen that model work as increasing numbers of our CGIU students really do then take their ideas and either start their own nonprofit or kind of incubate themselves in a larger nonprofit or sort of social enterprise upon graduation. And then the third question around kind of women in data and technology is one I'm deeply passionate about and sort of I actually talk about a lot because this is an area where here in the United States we've really lost ground. And I find, admittedly, kind of marking this in milestones in my own life kind of particularly illustrative. So both hopefully marrying the data with the personal narrative. So in 1987, when Santa Claus gave me a Commodore for Christmas, my first computer, thank you, Santa Claus, women comprised more than 37% of computer science graduates that year. In 2001, the year that I graduated from Stanford, women comprised about 21%. Yeah. Of computer science graduates. And in 2012, women comprised 16% of computer science graduates. Even though universities and colleges have been investing aggressively in growing their computer science programs. So this is an area where actually the statistics belie really the gaping gap that has developed in this area. And this is an area where the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has actually been tremendously vocal in saying kind of that we're going to have 1 million jobs between kind of today and 2020 in sort of the data and technology spaces in the United States, and that we're not kind of sufficiently training our best and our brightest math, science, technology engineers to fill those jobs. So we're becoming kind of increasingly uncompetitive. That narrative here in the United States is sadly pretty typical in the OECD. Across the OECD, most OECD countries have similarly seen an attrition of women in computer science programs in their universities. And we don't have data really for much of the developing world, but it certainly is data that should be queried and kind of then better known so that we can have a global picture of kind of what this challenge is, because it's not only the United States kind of where more computer science related jobs will be engines of growth, but around the world, particularly given all of the exciting new technologies and all of the kind of really dynamic entrepreneurs, particularly in parts of Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So it is an area where kind of different companies are really trying to tackle this challenge. Intel in particular has been a real leader in this area, but we certainly need kind of more focus on this question so that we, again, understand the dimensions of it globally. And then we need more companies like Intel to really care about addressing these gaps, not only here in the United States, but globally.
Well, let me just add a little bit, because Chelsea really did cover the landscape pretty much. The first question really addresses one of my pet peeves. I don't think we do a very good job of really looking at those success stories on the ground and learning from them. I hear this constantly from so many who are engaged in this process, who are measuring their results, see the results, and yet can't get the traction to grow that with additional support or the attention that they need where their own experience should be taken to a higher level. And I think we need some kind of a repository, a hub, a something in various areas. One of the things that I mentioned that we were working on with Avon was an attempt to do exactly that on projects that are really making a difference that could be scaled on violence against women. Because it's not rocket science. Some of these things really, when done well, and when you've got the solution, you can, taking into consideration cultural differences and everything else, you can really have impact. But what happens is when we do it in a small level. For example, UN Women has a whole special program devoted to fund for violence against women. We should be learning from those experiences. And I would say this is one of those challenges that we have not really adequately addressed to really grow the possibilities that could come from that. So that question, I think, goes to the heart of something much, much bigger and something we have to do collectively much, much better.
And I think that this really is an area, Jane, where universities could help play a role. Because I think one of the challenges is that kind of no one wants to say that by definition something being more effective, something is less effective, and then sort of inadvertently discouraging innovation. I mean, I think it would be disingenuous to acknowledge, to not acknowledge why this hasn't been done already. But it is something that I think it is time to do, not only because of the urgency of the ongoing challenges we face, but because we really do collectively now know a lot. We know a lot about what works in different environments. We know a lot about kind of what works to combat violence against women in urban areas versus rural areas. We know a lot about kind of what works best to combat violence against women in traditional tribal societies versus not. We know a lot about kind of what works best to combat violence against women in workplaces versus the home. And so we do know a lot, and we really kind of need someone to be courageous enough to put a stake in the ground and say kind of this really, these menu of options really have been proven to work. Here's the research that backs up that proof. Kind of do with it what you will, but kind of here is what you need to know to at least learn from what has worked to get started.
Great, and I think the sort of idea of your sort of networks of good practice where universities, companies, governments are coming together around particular challenges and intervention sets.
Well, that's one of the things that Georgetown is trying to do with the Center on Women, Peace, and Security is really determine what is working in this space, both in terms of women's participation, in terms of dealing with the violence, and also economic development in fragile states and post-conflict societies. So there's a lot we need to be doing better, and I think that question was dead on. I just want to quickly also follow up on the piece about women in data collection. Certainly, Chelsea hit the nail on the head going back to STEM, and certainly in this space. And I would also say that more broadly, companies are getting this. Intel, for example, did a study a couple years back on women in the web. And what they discovered with that study is that, and I was proud to be a part of it when I was in the State Department, because what the study shows is that there is a gender gap, a growing gender gap, and in Africa, for example, 43% fewer women than men have access to the internet. If this continues to grow in the wrong direction, we're going to take a whole lot of people out of 21st century job market and their possibilities. And so, as Chelsea alluded to, they've put together a program that was announced at CGI and is going to be launched here this week with UN Women at the helm, called She Will Connect, to really put an emphasis in targeted countries in Africa, in this case, on making the internet more accessible to large numbers of young women in particular, but older women as well, who are completely disconnected at this point. So I think these questions really focus on areas that really do cry out for a lot more investment.
And Jane, I would also say, one of the things I think we all candidly need to do a better job of, and this is something where fundamentally now committed to at the Clinton Foundation is being kind of honest and proud of areas where we've made a disproportionately positive impact, but also being honest and candid about areas where we haven't. You know, so at the Clinton Foundation, for example, in the HIV/AIDS space, one of the areas that we're kind of continuing to work on is all of our markets shaping work, you know, trying to change high-cost, low-volume markets into high-volume, low-cost markets. It's work that we started doing in 2002 with antiretrovirals, and now is work that we're doing in the pentavalence vaccine, the pneumococcal vaccine, the rotavirus vaccine, injectable, long-lasting, reversible contraceptives. An area where we did not have success really was in some of our behavioral change work in preventing mother-to-child transmission. We didn't have the right people on the ground to be doing that work, the technical people that could help governments build kind of analytical and logistic systems to ensure that they could sufficiently negotiate with generic pharmaceutical companies, or sufficiently partner with kind of the countries in their region to even more robustly negotiate with generic pharmaceutical companies, were not the same skills needed to help kind of rural clinics or urban clinics understand how to talk to women, engage with women, educate women, empower women around the challenges of preventing mother-to-child transmission, and kind of the many different ways in which those conversations needed to happen when a mother was pregnant versus nursing. And so that's an area where we no longer do any work. And so we're trying to be really candid now in our conversations with others in sort of the global health space about kind of what we really think we can bring to the table and what we can't. And so I certainly hope that that also is kind of part of how each of you think about kind of what you're doing in your own companies, sort of what have you really found to work with your employees, with their families, and what haven't you found to work, so that we can all better learn with and from one another.
Working at a university and writing case studies, one of the biggest challenges, as you say, is getting, whether it's companies, whether it's getting governments, whether it's getting non-profit organizations to admit and really be open about what hasn't worked. So another challenge to us. I am getting some very, very fierce directions from our timekeeper here that we unfortunately are about to run out of time. So what I'd like to do is just ask both Melanne and Chelsea to just close with one final sort of comment or set of comments, and that our title today is From Inspiration to Action, and it's Next Steps for the Private Sector. And it would be fantastic if both of you could put a challenge out there, 2 to 3 things that, you know, messages you would like the private sector companies in this room, but also hopefully companies hearing this all around the world, where the private sector can do more to address these issues. I mean, we've looked at them, a lot of them already on the panel, but what would be 2 to 3 key takeaway messages for the private sector in the area of women's empowerment? Melanne.
I'll just touch on perhaps some obvious points with a let's do it more aggressively pitch. One is, having been in government, having been in the NGO world and working very, very closely still today with the private sector, to really say that we need to understand each other. Each of us has a different perspective and a different goal, perhaps, even though there's a shared value in everything we do. And so to understand what each other knows going into a what each other needs going into a collaboration. I think that ability to put ourselves in the other person's space and then work together to make it a win-win for everybody is really vitally needed, because sometimes the conversations have been divorced from reality, or at least divorced from understanding where each is trying to come and then move forward on. Secondly, I said this already and I will say it again. Look at the synergies between what you are doing and what others are doing in the same space, or in variations in the same space, that together, when consolidated, can have even greater impact. I think that kind of ability to catalyze more is something, as there's greater activity, that we can do that much better. And then I think, finally, to understand that this is the way to go today, regardless where one sits, whether sitting in a company, making decisions, and having to do the hard work of persuasion within the company, and I know how difficult that can be, to source from women vendors, for example, in a local community, when you're up against your procurement official who says, look, I've always sourced with these people, they're highly competent, they give us what we need, we get sustainable value, and now you're telling me to come in and source from women who can equally meet that need and bring other value to the company in its emerging market. So I understand the difficulties within this space, within the companies, but in the end, data drives, and this does lead to the kinds of investments that both bring value to the company in terms of its bottom line, but also bring value to the broader community in which it wants to work. So to understand and make the case within the company and outside the company as to how this is that win-win we all want to see.
I guess I would say two quick things and then end with a question, or perhaps, I guess, more appropriately, a request for help. Just to build on what Melanne said, I think, on the first point, not to belabor it, but to enfranchise young people, but particularly young women, as you're thinking about kind of where you're uniquely positioned to make a difference. And also to think about how best to share the stories of what you've done that really has worked and hasn't to enfranchise and empower women. Sort of the private sector analog to what we were just talking about from the sort of nonprofit foundation social entrepreneurship space, I think would be tremendously helpful to all of us in this room. And then finally, sort of a request for help. At No Ceilings, we are deeply dedicated to ensuring that we have kind of the best data possible, as well as the best way to share this data for audiences of all ages and across the world, accessible on different platforms, so that it really has to be paid attention to and hopefully will be indeed inspiring toward action. We certainly need your help to do that. We talked about earlier kind of the traditional sources of data, and certainly kind of some of the companies that we've already reached out to in Silicon Valley, so that we have different search terms around the world, an idea that we candidly got from UN Women with their tremendous campaign around Women Can't, fill in the blank. But we know we don't know what we don't know. And a lot of you know a lot that we don't know. So please share your ideas around kind of what data we should be looking at. Share whatever data you'd be comfortable sharing. Share ideas about how you think we could best disseminate this data. Certainly if we could use some of your platforms to disseminate the data, if you would be open to that, certainly we would be open to having those conversations. I really do think this is one of those opportunities that if we miss it, it will be all to our kind of peril. So I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation today. I hope that it is the first of many continued conversations, and please send us your ideas. Thank you very much.
Great. No, well, thank you. Many, many thanks, Melanne and Chelsea, to you. And I think just 4 closing points from my side. One, whether you're a company or here to look at how you can work with companies, first of all, look at what you can do through your core business and core value chains and really harness the core capabilities of business. But secondly, look at the opportunities for working in communities with corporate foundations in the sort of the social investment side. Thirdly, as both Melanne and Chelsea have said, look at the public advocacy role and storytelling role and championing role you can play as companies, whether you have influence with governments, through your brands, through your advertising. And then fourthly, this question of research and data collection, data visualization, data personalization. So I think there's some very sort of specific action points we can take forward into the working groups. And I would just like to close by saying, as many of you who have been involved with either the Clinton Global Initiative or the Clinton Foundation know, one's not allowed to sit or go anywhere near a member of the Clinton family without making a commitment. So
I'm thrilled, Jane. Thank you.
So I would like to announce with our friends at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, our program at Harvard Kennedy School is going to be making a commitment to work with the U.S. Chamber to do some research on some of the business models and partnerships that companies are developing in the space of women's empowerment. So we look forward to
So you're
going
going
to
to start our Solutions Hub.
And we start a Solutions Hub, and a challenge to all the other research institutes and universities out there to do likewise. So thank you very much, and we'll break for 10 minutes and then come back for the next panel. Thank you, and thanks to Ryan and Chelsea.
Let me just say just a few things. What a wonderful panel. But I just wanted to applaud all three of you for your incredible leadership. And just, my quick takeaways from listening to the three of you, the three paradigms, Melanne, that you spoke of, which is just remember that women's participation is the greatest source, untapped source of prosperity in the world, that women are not victims, they're change agents. Chelsea, your point of the public-private partnerships, that networks are creative, opportunities for creative cooperation. And Jane, as you said, it is up to us because you all have incredible resources. I want to describe this 10-minute break. In the private sector, we call it a one-function break. Right, so restrooms are out this way, or you can email or you can chat. But we're going to start promptly in 10 minutes to hear a fantastic plenary on training as a catalyst for empowerment. Thank you again. Wonderful.